Welcome back, everyone, as we continue our look at the invasion of Quebec from the American Revolutionary War. We watched parts 1 and 2 yesterday. I'll put a link down in the description so you can check that out if you missed the first episode of the reaction. Today is parts 3 and 4. That'll wrap this up, but we are going to look at their follow-up to this in tomorrow's episode, which will be a look at the story of Benedict Arnold. It's a name that many people know, especially here in the States, as a very famous traitor from the Revolution. But what's the story behind that? That's, I'm sure, what we'll be looking at. So as always, the link is in the description to the original for episode 3. I highly encourage you to check out Extra History, one of my favorite channels creating history content on this platform. That's why we take a look at them so often, and they're also super supportive of our community here, Vlogging Through History, which I greatly appreciate. Let's dive into this one.
Wind comes down off the sea, bringing heavy flurries that coat the frozen ground. Snow gathers on the barricaded streets, piling so high buildings can only be entered through upper windows. Frost rhymes gun barrels, and both British soldiers and Canadian militia can see their breath fogging in the night and little past that.
So much like saying never get involved in a land war in Asia, or don't invade Russia in the fall, don't march your army on foot in the 18th century into Canada in December.
For this heavy snow obscures their vision, blowing and whirling, passing almost sideways. It barely betrays the silhouettes of soldiers carrying long muskets. The rebels are in Quebec. Thanks so much to the Extra History Calendar for sponsoring this episode. Wait a minute, that's us. Come be a part of our first ever Kickstarter campaign after the episode at the link below. Because
that's the calendar I was talking about earlier. I'm excited to get mine.
Not only do we think you're really gonna love it, but we paid a fortune for this ad. For Arnold and Montgomery, the time had finally arrived to move in. They'd spent weeks outside Quebec in the freezing cold, penning in the Crown forces amid the worst winter anyone can remember, and both are riding high on victory. Montgomery, despite his reservations in joining the rebellion, has also proved to be an able general. He expertly forced the garrison at St. John's to surrender by taking outer positions, intercepting supplies and reinforcements, and capturing a high point to pour fire down on the fort.
And you gotta say, I mean, there was a lot, during the American Revolution, there ends up being a lot of politics involved with how some of these generals get their positions. There's a whole cabal that tries to get rid of George Washington as commander-in-chief and replace him with someone like Horatio Gates or Charles Lee. And Lee and Gates were both constantly trying to undermine Washington, whereas Washington's trying to get people like Nathaniel Greene, who's a fantastic general for the Americans, into a position of authority. He's got Lafayette, who eventually becomes a very able commander, and he's got Benedict Arnold, who eventually rises to be a decent commander. Where Montgomery would have fit in all that is a question we'll never know the answer to.
And he'd taken Montreal without firing a shot. Benedict Arnold, for his part, had led his men on a perilous trek across a largely unknown wilderness, succeeding despite sabotaged maps and inadequate boats. Had he arrived a few days earlier, Quebec might have already fallen. But in front of Quebec, the most heavily fortified city in the Americas, their progress stopped. Montgomery had fired at the walls, trying to bait the garrison into sallying out to fight, but Carleton knew that the French had lost Quebec in the 7 Years' War for exactly that reason.
Yep.
He had more men, 1,800 to the Continental force of 1,100.
And typically, it changes over time, but typically the rule of thumb for attacking armies has been you want to have at least 3 times as many men as the fortress you're besieging, not just barely half as many.
Bigger guns and 8 months of supplies, so he settled in for a siege to wait the rebels out.
Smart.
Next, Montgomery sent increasingly threatening letters, demanding Carleton's surrender, saying that if he didn't, or he tried to destroy supplies, there would be no mercy shown. To his own troops, Montgomery declared that he would either, quote, dine in Quebec or in hell on Christmas Day. The calendar, however, weighed on Montgomery's mind, because on January 1st, most of his troops ended their terms of enlistment and would go home. They were freezing.
This is a very similar situation to what George Washington is going to face the following year in December of 1776, when he's got a very tiny army left after losing most of the army he defended New York City with, and he marches on Trenton, desperate to do something because the enlistments are about to run out and he's about to have no army.
and miserable. Plus, the Canadians were becoming increasingly hostile as the rebels demanded goods and services while paying in worthless paper currency. Meaning, before the new year, they would need to take the city by storm. Quite literally, actually.
This is such a bad scenario. You are outnumbered by the men who are in a strong fortified position, plenty of supplies to wait you out. It's the middle of winter. You've got a desperate timetable that you're up against. There's nothing going in the Americans' favor at this point.
Because as December wound down, it was clear that a blizzard was brewing. And should it roll in and cut visibility, it would be their best chance of breaching Quebec. A third of the Crown forces were Canadian militia, who Montgomery thought would prove reluctant and unskilled fighters and would run once battle commenced.
Maybe.
So Montgomery decided to attack the lower town, outside the city walls. For capturing the warehouses and goods there would put economic pressure on Carleton, already being urged by Quebec's merchants to surrender. He would approach from the south with 300 men, taking the palisade and outbuildings, while Arnold would lead 500 of his March veterans to do the same thing on the northern side. Also, diversionary attacks would pull British defenders to the eastern and western sectors. And at 5 a.m.,
Not
a
a bad
rocket
plan.
rises into the air, signaling the start of the assault. 90 minutes later, Montgomery's men creep into the city. To get there, they've had to negotiate a path 2 feet deep in snow and slide down a cliff with their coats pulled taut like a sled. He
Wow.
finds the town eerily quiet in the falling snow. They reach a wooden palisade, and Montgomery peers over its edge.
Just the way they're setting the stage of this and creating kind of an image in your mind of this kind of a fight. I would love to see something like this portrayed in TV or on film. Just something like this kind of a very unique scenario for an attack.
No one. He starts yanking out poles, making a hole for him and his soldiers. Now, Montgomery might have been a reluctant rebel. He might have even gotten his commission when his father-in-law had submitted his name without his knowledge, but he is a solid, charismatic commander who is leading from the front rank. He urges his men
all you
forward
can ask.
through the blinding snow. "Come on, my good soldiers," he says. "Your general calls you to come." There's now a 2-story blockhouse ahead. He draws his sword, ready to storm it. Then, as he approaches to 50 yards, the winds swirl and the snow parts, revealing 4 cannon in the blockhouse's window, pointing straight towards him. The faces of British soldiers float ghostly in the dark behind. Oh no. He opens his mouth to yell, but the blast covers the sound. The grape shot tears into his shoulder, his throat, and with a thick, wet thud, one ball embeds in his brain. Major General Richard Montgomery, leader of the invasion, falls instantly dead.
It was a gruesome injury. I think it tore off part of his face. It was bad, and you can imagine when you have a very charismatic leader that has encouraged the men to follow him from the front, and then he goes down. Imagine what that does to the morale in an already difficult situation.
Around him, staining the red snow, are his whole vanguard. A dozen men, including his second-in-command and his sergeant. A colonel, then coming up behind, orders the remaining men to retreat. Meanwhile, on the northern side of the city, Benedict Arnold and his troops creep into the dockside warehouses, approaching the palace gate. In the vanguard are Arnold and his famine-hardened March veterans, armed with rifles, and a gun crew dragging a 6-pounder cannon mounted on a sled to negotiate the deep snow. Behind them are a column of riflemen, militia, and a group of Canadians and native warriors that have joined the attack. They carry scaling ladders. Now, Quebec is a warren of stone buildings with narrow streets, bound in snow, and the Crown forces have erected barricades entirely sealing off major avenues. So, the plan is to blow down the walls with the cannon and then scale the remains. But the closer they can get before being sighted, the better this attack will go. Then suddenly, as they sneak past the palace gate, a volley from the ramparts rips into them. Iron grenades, their fuses hissing, arc down from above, embedding in the deep drifts and blowing up coughs of shrapnel-laced snow.
We don't think a lot about urban warfare in this time. It obviously does happen. Anytime you're attacking cities, you're going to have opportunities for urban warfare, but we don't think too much about urban combat happening in the American Revolution. We think of things like, men out in fields with lines of soldiers firing at each other. But this kind of stuff did happen, and it's a uniquely terrifying kind of combat for the attackers especially.
They rush forward to get out from under the fire, abandoning the heavy cannon when it lodges in a snowbank. They still have the ladders, though. Skirting the city, they pass into a narrow street running right against the shoreline, turning the corner to see another heavy barricade, this time more like a wooden wall. The street in front of it is narrow, choked with snowdrifts. Muskets bang behind the barricade. 2 cannons jet smoke, and he can see heads moving. Having lost his cannon, Arnold has no option but a frontal attack. He yells and waves his men on. They rush forward with ladders, while muskets stab and bullets whiz by, ricocheting off the walls and cobblestones. Suddenly, Arnold trips, hot pain in his ankle. Oh, he's been hit. Stung by one of the many bullets bouncing around the lane. He can no longer walk. 2 men grab him, helping him stay upright and move to the rear.
And I believe Arnold will walk with a limp for the rest of his life because of this wound.
Limps away, still calling encouragement to the men he'd led through starvation and wilderness. Captain Morgan takes over, urging the troops on.
Captain Morgan
He makes the barricade, shoving aside a hesitant rifleman and scaling the ladder, but then a musket goes off point blank, missing him, but scorching his face with the blast and sending him tumbling to the cobblestones. Undeterred, he mounts the ladder once more and hauls himself onto the parapet. Now surrounded by so many enemies, he has to roll under a cannon to avoid being bayoneted. His men follow, taking the barricade and capturing 30 prisoners. As they're herding the new captives, Morgan rushes ahead to the second barricade, knowing that if they make it over that, they're through. It's undefended, utterly empty, the gate open. But when he returns to rally his troops once more, they say they can't go on. For the rear of the column hasn't arrived yet, and their reinforcements that were supposed to cross the river and join them are nowhere to be seen.
What a mess.
Besides, now
even when you have success, other things are working against you.
they have prisoners, 3 times their own numbers, so how can they continue the attack? Morgan, frustrated, argues, but it's 30 minutes before the rest of the column arrives, and he can make an attempt on that second barricade. Now, however, they are met by heads moving on the parapet, and a party of Royal Navy sailors led by their officer who come out of the gate to meet them. The naval officer demands Morgan surrender, but instead, Morgan shoots him dead. The Americans yell, surge up the street, shouting that Quebec is theirs. They place more scaling
pretty
ladders,
hardcore.
but then they're pushed away, shots driving down on them. Men take to the houses on the street, trying to outflank the barricade, battling room to room with bayonets and point-blank fire, but the attack is eventually repulsed. Morgan orders his men to shelter in buildings and regroup for another attack, but they're too afraid. For anyone stepping into the street at this point is cut to ribbons with a volley. As the hours pass, their ammunition begins to run dry, and they realize that the British soldiers are now behind them. They're trapped, penned into the city they'd meant to capture.
And again, I mean, you got the weather working against you. You're outnumbered. Your commanding officer has been killed. Reinforcements aren't arriving. You're in urban combat. You're surrounded. You're hundreds of miles from home territory. There's nothing good about any of this.
Their army's commander is dead, their second-in-command wounded, and a third of their troops trapped inside of the walls. It's a monumental defeat. Yet Arnold, outnumbered 3-1, refuses to retreat. 4 British reinforcements are inbound to Quebec, and their counterattack may doom the revolution. Of course, that all depends on when they're scheduled to arrive. Hold on.
Yep. Let's dive into part 4.
Benedict Arnold is not having a happy New Year's Day. He lies in a makeshift hospital outside Quebec, pale from blood loss. His invasion is a disaster. 100 Continental troops are dead and 44 wounded. Montgomery is slain, and 426 Continental soldiers, most of them from his own unit, are now prisoners. Others are...
And it's important to note here that those numbers don't sound big, like 100 dead, but that's a significant amount in the Revolutionary War, especially for the size of this force. There are not thousands of dead in any of these battles, and actually far more Continental soldiers and militia are going to die as prisoners of disease in places like the Sugar House prison in New York City, or on these prison hulk ships that they would put them on, versus battle deaths.
Are scattered, some fallen through the ice while retreating across the river. Fully, half of the army is killed, wounded, or captured. In return, they have inflicted only 20 casualties to the British, 6 of them fatalities, and soon they will sally out to finish them off.
And I have to point this out all the time because there's a lot of confusion about this. When you say casualties, it doesn't mean dead. It means anybody who's no longer currently able to continue as a soldier at that moment. So if you're killed, if you're wounded, if you're captured, if you're missing, you're a casualty.
The surgeon tells Arnold he must evacuate south. But instead, Arnold orders the wounded to arm themselves and asks for his own sword and pistols. That's right, Zoe. Doesn't look like Arnold's gonna retreat.
He could be a little stubborn.
Thanks so much to Nebula for continuing to be the best deal in streaming. Plus, you can see our next episode that deep dives into Benedict Arnold's infamous treason right now over there before you can see it anywhere else. Had Governor Carleton sallied out to attack the American camp, the invasion of Quebec would have been over. He had twice Arnold's numbers and was far better supplied with ammunition. Instead, though, unsure of the Continental numbers and remembering how the French had lost Quebec by sallying out during the French and Indian War, he consolidated.
So Carleton, as we saw in the previous episode, his caution had served him well earlier in that he allowed them to come to him. But that can also backfire on you when you are in a place of advantage.
Waiting for the bottled-up contingent under Morgan to run out of ammunition and surrender. Morgan was the last to give up his sword, to a French priest rather than a British officer. Though later criticized for his lack of speed, Carleton was perhaps wise not to gamble his position of strength. After all, he had destroyed a rebel assault with only nominal casualties and was waiting for reinforcements from Britain. Logic dictated that the siege could not last now that the rebels were so reduced in numbers, yet last it did, for nearly 6 months. Despite smallpox ravaging the American ranks, desertions, expiring enlistments, bitterly cold weather, and the local Canadians growing hostile at still being paid for supplies and services in useless paper currency, Arnold hung on. With only 600 troops, he still bottled up Quebec. Which, to be clear, was an impressive military feat,
It was.
given that usually conducting a siege requires 2 attackers for each defender, not the other way around.
And like I said in the previous episode, I feel like often they desire 3 to 1.
A trickle of reinforcements arrived, but the recruitment stymied because few men wanted to go to Canada. Heck, Washington himself was running out of soldiers, with few re-enlisting. Plus, the American officer garrisoning and mismanaging Montreal refused to leave for fear of an uprising.
Yeah, so I did a video on what was happening in the Revolutionary War in 1776. If you want to check that out, it's called 1776, the year America was born and nearly died. But yeah, the first half of the year, Washington's besieging Boston. But he comes to an agreement after those guns that they've captured at Fort Ticonderoga are hauled across the mountains over to Boston by Henry Knox. They surround the city with guns. The British realize they can't hold Boston, and in exchange for being allowed to withdraw from the city rather than being shelled, they agree not to burn Boston on their way out. But Washington knows they're coming back, so he had sent Charles Lee down to start preparing the defenses of New York City, which is where Washington very smartly knew the British would come back, and they come back with 30,000 soldiers. And it was described that all London appeared to be afloat outside of New York City. And then they defeat Washington, they run him out of there, they run him across New Jersey and to Pennsylvania. So it's a bad year for the American cause.
Meanwhile, Carleton also wasn't endearing himself to the local population. While he treated his American prisoners well, like captured soldiers rather than rebels, he ruthlessly pursued any Canadian collaborators. He stripped their militia commissions and seized property, and used old French laws to draft labor from the population. To this, he added religious pressure. The Bishop of Quebec was a staunch ally of his and excommunicated any Canadians who supported the revolutionaries, even in speech. The Americans tried to mollify the restive Canadian population with a diplomatic visit from a commission led by Benjamin Franklin, but truly the central issue was money, and Congress had none to give. Therefore,
yeah, they didn't have any money to pay their troops. They didn't have money to do anything. It was an ongoing problem, and the British knew this, and they tried to take advantage of it, and they would flood the American continent with counterfeit currency, this paper money, to try and devalue it even further. And there were actually executions. One of my ancestors was actually hanged for helping distribute this fake money. He was hanged by the Americans for that.
Or once
Serious
the British
crime.
reinforcements arrived under General John Burgoyne, it was clear the situation was untenable. The Americans retreated, evacuating across the border and into Lake Champlain in June of 1776, with Arnold honoring a promise he'd made to the Army's new field commander. Yes, he'd been passed over again, was the last man to leave Canada. With the Redcoat Army on his heels, Arnold secured a boat, shot his horse to prevent capture, directing his aide to do the same, then pushed the boat off with his own hands. But while the invasion had failed, it was already having repercussions far beyond the borderlands. Arnold's stoicism, it seemed, found admirers in Congress, who commended him and gave him a promotion to brigadier general. Yet his desperate letters also pressed home the necessity of soldiers signing enlistments for longer than 1 year. Because at the beginning, it was thought the war might be short, that it might not really be a war at all.
How many times have you heard that in history? Oh, it's going to be a quick war. It's going to be, everybody's going to be home by Christmas and that kind of thing. People always start out with that optimism, and then reality sets in as you actually get into the war. And the same thing happens in the American Civil War. They start out with 3-month enlistments, then many go to 1-year enlistments, and then eventually it's 3 years or the duration of the war.
Had they taken Quebec, for example, it was believed that it could be used as a bargaining chip to extract concessions from London, opening a path to reconciliation. That wasn't going to happen now, though. For the same day that news of the New Year's Eve defeat at Quebec arrived in Philadelphia, Congress also received word that King George III had made a speech declaring the American revolutionaries traitors and refusing to negotiate.
Yeah, this is the Proclamation of Rebellion that I talked to. They showed this in John Adams. If you see that, they have a slightly fictionalized version of this proclamation that John Hancock reads to the Continental Congress. It was issued in October 1775. It's also the one that gets paraphrased into the song "You'll Be Back" in the musical Hamilton, where he says, "I will send a fully armed battalion to remind you of my love."
This shut off the possibility of reconciliation right quick and pushed Congress closer to the previously radical idea of declaring independence from Great Britain. After all, Washington's victory at the Siege of Boston in March of 1776 did suggest that a military solution might be feasible. And that viewpoint had a very strange cheerleader, the ghost of Richard Montgomery. Okay, let me explain. In February 1776, Thomas Paine published a pamphlet where Montgomery...
This is the same Thomas Paine that wrote Common Sense, and then in December of 1776, he's going to write The American Crisis, which includes the words, "These are the times that try men's souls." He's the propagandist for the American cause. And he's only been in America for a couple of years at this point.
Rose from the dead and urged a reluctant congressman to break with Britain. Now, if you are asking why Paine chose a reluctant rebel like Montgomery to bear this message, it's because that in death, Montgomery had become America's first military martyr, more patriotic symbol.
I wouldn't say he was the first, because you have General Warren, who is killed at Bunker Hill, who was a prominent patriot as well.
At this point than real person. Congress even paid for an elaborate monument in New York, where his body would later be reinterred in 1818. And even before the war ended, he was the subject of romantic portraits. Today, 11 counties are named after Montgomery, along with 5 cities, including the capital of Alabama. His glory also rubbed off on others. For instance, Aaron Burr had served under Montgomery during the assault on Quebec and received...
I was a captain under General Montgomery until he caught a bullet in the neck in Quebec. That's from Hamilton.
Popular fame because he had attempted, bravely though unsuccessfully, to drag the general's corpse out of the city. He then parlayed that notoriety into an appointment to Washington's staff. Meanwhile, Arnold was still trying to prevent the British counter-invasion. October 11th, 1776, Valcour Island, Lake Champlain. Benedict Arnold, currently carrying the position of Commodore, has the British fleet right where he wants it. Granted, his force was never going to match the Royal Navy. They've shipped prefabricated boats in pieces for the mission, and American shipbuilders cannot match their numbers. Not to mention the British have more ships, more cannons, more trained soldiers and gunners. Arnold's fleet is mostly gunboats with few veteran crew. But he knows the lake, has picked a bay where his fleet remains hidden as the British pass a narrow juncture, and can bait them into attacking him upwind. Cannons roar. Shots arc down on the decks of the crowded ships. An American gunboat runs aground damaged. A British gunboat explodes. And Arnold's flagship, the Congress, takes 28 hits. They force the British to break contact. But by sunset, most of the American fleet is damaged or sinking. Yet the next morning, when the Royal Navy closes in to finish Arnold, he's already slipped away. They sight the remaining fleet just as Arnold runs it aground and burns it, with the American flag still flying, never striking their colors. In fact, Arnold puts the torch to Congress himself, the last to do so, in full view of the British. Though a defeat, Arnold had slowed the British, preventing Burgoyne from reaching his intended target of Albany before the winter.
So you start to get a sense, and we're going to talk more about it when we talk about Arnold's story tomorrow, but you start to get a sense of why this was such a deep betrayal. Benedict Arnold wasn't just some random American officer. He's one of the heroes of the Revolution. He is loved by George Washington and trusted by him. He's given the military governorship of Philadelphia after the Americans retake the city from the British later on, while he's recovering from wounds. And he's one of the reasons why Saratoga is won. He's probably the hero of Saratoga later on. Saratoga is the turning point of the war because that's what gets the French into the war. So all of that just built it up so much. So this was a big, big deal for the British to be able to bag somebody like Arnold as a turncoat.
Though had Burgoyne done so, Washington would have evacuated New York to find another British army at his back and probably would have been crushed. 1776 marked the last time Americans set foot in Canada during the Revolution. Lafayette was put in charge of a new expedition in 1778, but scuttled it, deeming the plan infeasible given the resources available and Carleton's hardening of defenses.
Smart.
During negotiations to end the war, the Americans briefly made a bid to include it as part of the colonies, but the claim was just so absurd, British negotiators scotched it and it was never brought up again. But the war did change Canada. After a peace treaty was signed, 50,000 British loyalists moved from the United States to Quebec province, largely settling in Nova Scotia. Then, frustrated about living in a land of French culture, language, and laws, they began to lobby for Quebec to be split into French and English portions. The result was Upper and Lower Canada. Names based on the St. Lawrence River's flow, that's why Upper Canada is on the bottom.
You see that all the time. You'll see that in Ohio, we have Upper and Lower Sandusky, and Upper Sandusky is below Lower Sandusky. Upper and Lower Egypt were the same way. Like he said, it's about where the river flows, not about north and south.
With separate parliaments and legal systems. Within decades, these English settlers had adopted the name of Canadians, which before then had been used exclusively to refer to the French majority. Meanwhile, those now called French Canadians were no closer to becoming mainstream British subjects. In fact, Carleton's heavy-handedness had further alienated them. These moves helped create the genesis of modern Canada and its strained relationship with Quebec. Yet it had special significance to one man, Benedict Arnold. Though he'd received praise for marching across the wilderness, fighting on despite wounds, and holding together a disintegrating army, he had his detractors as well. One political enemy referred to him as, quote, our evil genius, and said he'd led a whole fleet to destruction. Others, officers he'd quarreled with, tried to have him court-martialed, and those feuds continued in the years after, poisoning his career and hobbling promotions. And as we'll see next week, or right now if you're watching on Nebula, within him, a seed of treason had begun to grow.
Yeah, and I don't know that it grew as treason. It starts as resentment and jealousy, and when the opportunity presents itself, then becomes treason. The British did a great job of fostering that through people like John Andre. So we'll talk about that tomorrow when we get to that episode. Until then, thanks for watching.